There were other tensions with the army, too.
I would say, frankly, that sometimes our relations with our advisors were not that good. We found sometimes American officers' attitude arrogant, quite overbearing, and very disdainful of the Korean army and tradition, which Korean army at that time didn't have much. But we, as young officers, with our affection and love for the country, there were sometimes some problems. But we kept most of them to ourselves.
For the 5 million refugees who flooded the South, the war was a calamity beyond belief.
The Korean people were in a dreadful state. The hunger, the poverty was really dreadful. Children running after you, asking for food and the like. It really was terrible. I had as a batman a gentleman of, I should say, 50 years of age, who was the ex-mayor of Suwon, which is a town just south of Seoul. He was working for me as a batman for 2 shillings a week plus a bottle of gin. He existed on that.
Seoul in the fall of 1952 was Kafka land. On the one hand, you had senior American officers and some of the high-ranking civilians living very high off the hog, drunken parties and cases of champagne, that sort of thing, and lots of ladies of the night, and generally the kind of thing that you can read about in Catch-22. On the other hand, you had a desperate civilian population. You had at least 50,000 children being fed by emergency milk and soup stations. You had a hungry population scavenging in the ruins. Seoul was 80% destroyed, at least 80% destroyed. It was a city of ruins. It was like Germany after World War II.
Korea's millions of abandoned children brought out the softer side of the American troops.
The GIs are terribly soft-hearted people, and orphanages were very, very commonly supported by soldiers. They'd see these children and give very generously, both in goods and in money. In fact, running orphanages became a bit of an industry, and large numbers of children that got into orphanages were not, in fact, orphans.
The refugees tried to make a new life in shantytowns around cities like Busan.
The city was full of refugee shacks lining the streets. On either side of the streets there would be rows of temporary shacks.
On the military front, Eisenhower was trying to end the long stalemate with heavy hints that he would use atomic weapons.
He realized that mere diplomatic negotiations would probably not end the war, and that he would have to have the threat of overwhelming a military force and strength behind him in any negotiations. So that was a part of his plan, and he carried that out and made it very clear to the Chinese and the North Koreans that whatever was necessary in the way of military force would be used. I think that any intelligent enemy would have understood that the use of atomic weapons in that situation was imminent. If there was not a ceasefire arranged.
Many felt conventional weapons were not enough.
We believed that the United Nations forces headed by America should have used all the facilities at their disposal, including the atomic bomb. I do not necessarily speak for the Royal Australian Navy when I say that. I speak for myself and those around me. I think the philosophy that bombing the hell out of the North Koreans and the Chinese Communist forces in order to persuade them to give an inch at the peace talks was a fallacy. I don't think it happened. The British forces did not really believe that was the way to deal with Orientals. The Americans, however, pursued the idea, and we executed it.
With total command of the coastline as well as the air, the UN poured an immense mass of bombs and shells on North Korea in the third year of the war.
I think that the real heroes of this war were not the generals and not the soldiers and even less the politicians. They were these simple people, the peasants and especially the women. I saw these women planting rice and plowing and working from morning to night, and the children on their backs and going on in their work. And the climate is not always favorable there. There were floods and there were cyclones which destroyed the crop, and they started again and again.
The worst devastation still came from the sky. But the Chinese and North Korean air forces had greatly expanded, and Russian pilots in large numbers clashed with American aces, like the young John Glenn.
And it was a matter of the old World War II style dogfighting, getting in behind and hammering someone or getting hammered yourself if he got on your tail. And so it was really machine against machine and pilot against pilot. There were Russian pilots, and in fact, on 2 of the days that I got MiGs, the intelligence people told us later that there was more Russian being spoken on the air those days than there was any other language. So I don't know to this day who I was up against, but the one where we did the climbing turn that I talked about in the dive was whoever that fellow was, he knew how to use his airplane to the best advantage.
John Glenn shot down 3 MiG fighters. Russian casualties have only now been acknowledged by the Soviet Union.
And I visited the graves where the flyers that were participating in the war or helping the Koreans were buried. And for me it was an emotional moment because I saw many graves of people, mostly of my officers and privates, about my age or even younger than me, who fell in this war. They survived during the Great Patriotic Wars. Many of them went through this war, and then they perished in the Korean sky.
Joseph Stalin is dead. The Kremlin's cold stone walls, the eerie face of Moscow, a howling wind and snow adding to the somber picture is the description accompanying the announcement that
the death of Stalin in March 1953 brought a change in Russian policy. Molotov returned as foreign minister. On both sides, old misjudgments came to be reassessed.
When the Korean War started, I believed quite wrongly that it was planned as a Soviet diversion to deflect us from Europe. That was the conventional view, and it was the wrong view. I believe that the Soviet Union acquiesced in, or maybe even encouraged, a Korean attack on the theory that this was a cheap victory to pick up, might have a demoralizing impact on the United States, might deflect us somewhat from Europe, but they never expected that a war would start on the Korean Peninsula that would force continuing decisions of them.
It forced decisions from the Chinese, too. Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai signaled that a formula could be found for prisoners refusing repatriation. The new line even reached the prison camps.
The propaganda line from Peking, Beijing, was, "We are going to sweep you into the sea." They believed that. "Whatever you do, you cannot resist us. We shall sweep you out of Korea." Then they realized after the later offensives, they are not going to do that.